Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISARR.com.
Welcome everyone, thanks for downloading another episode of the podcast. But before we start, I want to talk about promoting the pod. This is our 33rd episode. We've got over 90,000 downloads, 110 5-star reviews on Spotify and 101 ratings at 4.9 stars on Apple. But we need more help to spread the good news. So if you like what we do, get busy and please give us a 5-star review somewhere. Our guest today is Matt Harding, who served in the Royal Artillery and also had the misfortune to be my troop commander, but he probably doesn't want to mention that as we're going on. And on this podcast, we're going to be talking about his deployment to Bosnia and the impact operations in that country had on him. The situation around the war in the former Yugoslavia is extremely complex. Not only did war fighting take place in Europe, it also saw ethnic cleansing and a type of organised killings of civilians and military personnel last seen in Nazi-occupied countries in World War II. And Matt's going to give us a bit of a flavour of that as we go on. So, thanks for coming on the pod, Matt. Can you start by telling us what year you joined the army, what made you enlist, and what you did prior to the Bosnia deployment?
Certainly. Firstly, I thought it was you that was the troop commander. I don't know if I got that the wrong way around. That's certainly how you behaved. So I joined the army way back in 1985, I think, and it was really an unplanned move calculated at getting up my father's nose, and that absolutely worked. He had planned for me a fabulous career, an arranged place at Oxbridge, and generally sort of following the family pattern, but that didn't really fit my personal ethics. So I bunked off school one afternoon and went off to do the selection for Royal Marines officer training, which I managed to scrape through somehow. But in those days, they had one intake per year, and the next intake was some 13 months hence. So I went off and did the army one, and they said, "Great, you can come next month." And I went back to announce the good news to my happy family, who were not very happy for much longer, unfortunately. But that's essentially why I joined the army. It wasn't a very well pre-planned strategy. It just sort of happened, and I rolled into it and arrived in Sandhurst in September 1985.
Had your old man been in the army, had he, Matt?
No, absolutely not. His family during the Second War, they're a family of landowners and farmers, basically. So during the Second War, they were involved in food supply, merchant navy, and a very, very long way from the front line. My mother's family were very different. My grandfather on my mother's side fought with the Chindits in Burma. His father was at several of the significant battles of the First World War, and all of his brothers, most of them actually fell in the First War.
So you went to Sandhurst as a non-grad, which was wasn't unusual in the mid-80s, I remember. We used to quite a few young troop commanders who hadn't been to university had gone straight to Sandhurst.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably about 50-50 in those days. And of course, it was known as the graduate course and the proper course, because the graduates clearly got a much easier run of things, as they do in so much in life. But no, there was tremendous rivalry between the two courses. Frankly, they're not terribly different. They're about the same length, and they carry most of the same sort of things. The difference being, as a graduate comes out of Sandhurst with 2 pips, and a non-graduate comes out with 1 pip.
Is it? And that's pretty much by the by now, isn't it? You have to have a degree to go to Sandhurst now, I believe.
I really don't know. Actually, I'm so far removed from it. I really don't know.
I thought the difference between the two courses was less cutlery on the table.
Well, I'm relieved, Kev, of course, that you now know that cutlery does go on the table,
yes,
which is certainly an improvement from previous years.
Yeah, he doesn't eat with his hands as much anymore, Matt. You made an impression on him. So what happened after you finished Sandhurst training?
I actually joined Sandhurst with a view of becoming an infanteer, and I was sponsored into Sandhurst by the Duke of Edinburgh's Royal Regiment. Lord alone knows what they've become now, but they were basically my local infantry regiment. But having spent a few nights cold and wet at Sandhurst, I decided that probably wasn't the life for me, and was seduced to joining the Gunners. So directly after Sandhurst, newly commissioned officers zoom down to Larkhill and do the Young Officers course, or the YO's course as it's known. And I think it's about 3 months, where you basically work out which is the pointy end and which is the blunt end of a gun, how to pass azimuth to guns, how to run a CP, and all of those good things. So you turn up in your first gun regiment, knowing a little bit more than you did before you went to YO's course, but not nearly as much as your average gun number one, I guess. So directly after YO's course, I went out to a self-propelled gun regiment in Gütersloh in Germany, 4-7 Field Regiment, which was an Abbott regiment at the time, part of what was affectionately known as the covering force in the old Cold War deployment in British Army of the Rhine. So the plan was basically that the covering force went forward, close forward to the inner German border, and tried to slow down the Russian hordes whilst everybody else deployed. I think it was probably a bit of a forlorn hope in ancient parlance.
And range of an Abbott got binned out because it had 105 shell, wasn't very effective, and didn't have much range as well, so you'd been up against it firing them.
Absolutely, about as effective as a good headbutt against a decent tank.
Well, if you're a Scotsman, mate, the tank's going to suffer, isn't it?
Well, exactly, yeah, and the Scotsman wouldn't, so, you know.
So what tours did you do when you were there?
So a good quantity of my first tour was actually spent in Germany. Lots of adventure training. I led expeditions to the Himalayas, to a caving expedition to Sardinia. We went to Cameroon. We went to various other places. Obviously, the ever-present Battus training over in Canada. But it was at the end of my time in Germany that I met with General Sir John Learmont, affectionately known as the Raging Bull, who was at that time running Bricksmiths in Berlin. And I mentioned that I spoke a few words of Russian, and he said, "Well, you, a young man, must come and visit Bricksmiths." So I went and did a detachment to Bricksmiths way back when. So this would have been in the late 80s. And thoroughly enjoyed myself and got on extremely well with the crew there, and very well with General Learmont. And he decided that was going to be the career for me. And I was due to go to Durham University to study Russian for 3 years on an in-service degree, which I think, had I completed it, and I'll give you the reasons that I didn't in a moment, would probably have given me a very different path in life to the one I've actually lived. So I was 1 month away from going to Durham University. Parents clearly delighted, because finally their prodigal son was actually going to go and get an education of his own volition. But a tour of South Armagh popped its head up for the battery, 4 battery, funnily enough, which obviously became 4-7, was merged with 7-3 to become 4-7-3 battery later in life, was off to South Armagh. And as a very young man and as a gunner, you didn't get to do proper rural tours of Northern Ireland very often. So I either foolishly or otherwise, you judge, said, I'm not going to go to university. I'm going to go and spend 6 months in South Armagh. So off I went and deployed. I think we came back. Yes, we came back to the UK. 4-7 Regiment came back to the UK to go to Thorney Island, and from Thorney Island we did our NITAT training, as it was called then, Northern Ireland Training Advisory Team Training, I think that stands for. And I was made the IO intelligence officer at Bestbrook Mill, and absolutely had a blast. It was a really incredible tour. We had some very sad tragedies, obviously, so I'm not celebrating those. We lost some good people over there, and sadly we're in the follow-up to the loss of a number of dear RUC colleagues. But generally speaking, it was an immensely fun tour. As IO and in theatre at that time, I worked very closely with the Force Research Unit, with TCG, with Group, with various other elements of government, special branch, and really did have the most incredible grounding in how intelligence really worked and what the intelligence really was in the background of the conflict in Northern Ireland, and it gave me a very interesting perspective on life.
I think it's interesting. We've covered it on a couple of the podcasts. You know, people look at the Northern Ireland campaign, and much of the time they just conjure up guys in camouflage patrolling the streets or the fields. But it was the intelligence war and sort of special forces operations that really depleted the IRA to the extent that they found themselves at the negotiating table. So, you know, do you think that's a fair point to bring up, Matt?
Absolutely, but that is not to minimise in any shape or form the work done by the Green Army, without whom the intelligence nor the special forces could have done what they did.
And the Green Army gathered a lot of intelligence whilst out on their normal patrols.
It not only gathered a lot of intelligence, but it was very successful in drawing attention away from certain intelligence and certain things. So it played a very, very important role. And of course, let's not forget, was responsible for some very effective kinetic action during some of the more heated times of the campaign. It's quite a difficult subject to discuss in broad conversation now, because clearly the world has grown a slightly different perspective on the troubles as they have become known, or the conflict in Northern Ireland. When as a soldier working in Northern Ireland, and I did several tours throughout my career, you clearly form an opinion from one side of the fence, and to hear the past being reinvented and looking at what really brought or sort of knowing what really brought peace to Northern Ireland, and then looking at the political spin that has subsequently been put on it, is a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow in some ways. But I think the important thing is that peace, by and large, is holding. A lot of activity under the blankets, but given the efforts from all sides of the community, I think a fairly firm lid is being kept on things.
And a flawed peace is better than no peace. I think we've talked about that a few times before.
Absolutely.
What else did you do sort of prior to going to Bosnia then?
So it was whilst I was in Northern Ireland that, again, working alongside intelligence and special forces, that I thought perhaps that might be the life for me. But again, still pretty young in the grand scheme of things. I had a sergeant in my intelligence cell who had come from the Special OP troop, a chap by the name of Tony Story, and he told me all about the Royal Artillery's own unit, and it sounded very attractive to me. So my aspiration really was to go directly from Northern Ireland, either to Hereford or onto the group course, and go directly into that environment. But I think the more people I talked to, particularly the people within that environment, it became apparent that I was too young, not mature enough, and frankly, without enough life experience to be able to do it effectively. So I decided on an interim step of coming to the newly formed Special OP Battery, 7-3 Battery, and I joined 7-3 Battery in Dortmund in, I think, late 1990, where obviously I met you guys. We went, I think, I completed the Special OP Battery selection, which was very challenging. I think, probably one of the most challenging things I've ever done. Physically, frankly, I didn't find it very hard because I was quite fit and a very keen sportsman. But it was the combination of mental capacity required all day and all night for day in, day out, and the amount of things that we had to learn, and the degree of expertise that one had to have in radio communications, Soviet tactics, Soviet machinery, etc. There was just a never-ending list of things which we had to learn: survival, escape and evasion, all sorts of bits and pieces. So it really was very, very challenging. And I think at the end of every week, collapsed absolutely exhausted into my bed, only to start again early on the following Monday. But finish it did, and I seemed to do reasonably well. Got through the course, and I think fairly shortly afterwards we deployed on a big exercise up to, I think, Zoltau, but I'm maybe misremembering. And whilst we were there, we got given notice to move to the first Gulf War, Operation Granby. Clearly travelled out there, and that's a whole other story. We can talk about that maybe on a future date. But as you'll be very aware, we went out on an LSL, a logistics ship, the Sebedovir, I think, the RFA Sebedovir. Most memorable moment of that trip was getting onto the boat and very arrogantly telling the officers in the wardroom that I was a very keen sailor and I didn't get seasick. Cue the Bay of Biscay 3 days later in a Force 9 with one of the engines out, which meant we were plodding along at some ludicrously low speed, reeling backwards and forwards. I really don't think I've ever wanted to die quite as much in my entire life.
And then the toilets blew back as well, if you remember.
They absolutely did, yeah. And the ship was an absolute mess, and we limped. I think we spent a short period of time alongside in Gibraltar, and then went on to Cyprus, where they tried to fix the thing.
How did Bosnia come about then, Matt?
So Bosnia was right at the very other end of my career. So in between times, I spent time with 1 RHA, 7 RHA, and I ended up as adjutant of 2-6 Regiment following Staff College, Junior Division Staff College. And I got sent out to Bosnia at the end of Op Grapple, which, if you'll recall, was the British Army's contingent to UNPROFOR, the United Nations protection force in Bosnia that had been there for some time. I think they deployed in 1992, but fighting intensified considerably whilst they were there, and it became apparent that they didn't have enough combat power to be able to fulfill the tasks that they were there to do, and that actually things were going to get an awful lot worse before they started getting better. So the conflict intensified enormously, and NATO got a mandate from the United Nations and was involved in the conflict and started patrolling the skies with significant air power. And started assisting the troops on the ground. And clearly there was a considerable amount of ethnic cleansing and war crimes going on at that time. So the air power assisted with that, preventing that awful set of atrocities. I think a British plane was actually shot down during that time as well, which I think escalated the interest of the British public. And that led ultimately to another UN mandate being signed, and it was decided that NATO would send in a force to enforce the Dayton Peace Agreement. All three factions were pulled to the table and signed a ceasefire, and then it was decided to put a NATO force in. So I was sent down at the end of Op Grapple, ostensibly to do a reconnaissance for the artillery element for the NATO deployment. I planned to spend a week there, but being a good OP soldier, I took all my kit to stay there as long as I needed to, and it's a good job that I did, because as I arrived, I met Brigadier, as was then, Richard Dannett, now Lord Dannett, obviously, quite the most impressive individual I think I have ever met in my entire life. Absolutely phenomenal leader, phenomenal soldier, and an incredible brain. I bumped into him, and we had a bit of a chat about some of the things I'd done in my career to that point. He said, well, now you're here, you might as well stay. And I got taken really into a sort of hybrid brigade reconnaissance role, which makes it sound an awful lot grander than it was. It was me and a driver and a Land Rover, and I was basically shooting around either side of the separation zone, looking for routes for the NATO force to move in, and also for bits of real estate big enough to actually house them, including a full AS-90 regiment, which takes up a heck of a lot of real estate, tanks, warriors, you name it. There was a full combat brigade, armoured combat brigade, and we had to put them all somewhere. So I had a very, very busy job shooting around the place. And if you envisage the environment at the time, the war had only just finished, and I'm sort of doing those irritating bunny ears around finished, because there were lots of little skirmishes, huge numbers of different, quite apart from the three main protagonists, there were lots of different paramilitary groups. Yeah, they all broadly had signed up to the agreement, but there were local skirmishes, land grabs. Organised crime raised its head, and like it so often does at the end of any conflict. So it was still a pretty spicy environment to work in.
What was the most challenging part of your tour, from the initial part and this complexity you moved into?
So I think there were a couple of aspects, really. I think there is the technical oblique professional aspect, in that I had so much to do, so much ground to cover. Funnily enough, I recently, quite by chance, uncovered my marked up map, which I used for my reconnaissance, and there was just a vast amount of ground to cover. Both of you spend a lot of time in reconnaissance, and you know just how much work is required to cover large areas, and to look at this kind of thing. Getting all of that work done in areas that weren't necessarily cleared of hostile forces, or indeed of landmines, unexploded munitions, etc. So it was professionally really quite challenging. Emotionally, it was really quite challenging, in that I was kind of on my own. I had a fabulous driver, a chap called Sergeant Perry, and it is to my regret that I don't know where he is now. If he's listening to this, I'd love to get in touch and have a beer, because we had a really interesting time over there together. He and I driving around the countryside doing all these acts of daring do. But also there was the fact that the war had just finished, and there was horrific detritus of war, destroyed infrastructure, destroyed communities, and no shortage of dead bodies and evidence of the ethnic cleansing which went on as the forces withdrew. And I think it was also at a time, there weren't a tremendous number of soldiers in an armoured brigade who had combat experience, who had been in these environments before, and therefore there was quite a reliance on a small number of us who had some yards under the belt, and were there not only as leaders of younger, less experienced soldiers and officers, but mentors and in some ways counsellors. So that was all of those things combined, I think, made it a really quite challenging time.
Was this around about the time that the soldiers from an armoured battle group got taken hostage by one of I can't remember the group that it was, but there was a load of from an infantry battalion got taken hostage, wasn't it?
That's right.
Was it round about that time, Matt? Or
no, that actually happened. That actually happened, I believe, prior to the ceasefire. I think those were soldiers from UNPROFOR, So before my time, I absolutely recall the incident you're talking about. It was a long time ago, and I can't remember the detail, but that was definitely before I went out there. And so fast forwarding now to after the NATO force moved in, and my goodness, was that a feat of logistics. Basically, we had a singular circuit route which covered the whole of the multinational division southwest area, and a lead-in from the docks at Split. And for those who saw the docks at Split, you think about bringing an entire armoured brigade's worth of kit through that tiny little dock and up and down that small road, all the way up into country. It was a massive feat. And working in the brigade headquarters with the logisticians, with the G3 ops, and obviously with the intelligence, looking at I'm going to call it the enemy picture, because that's what we called it at the time, not necessarily seeing them as the enemy, but it was certainly the hostile picture, and managing this movement where you've got lay loaders and tanks and AS-90s and warriors going down these tiny little tracks, that were not in the best state of repair. So roads were collapsing. We're having to get Royal Engineers in there to fix them. So, once the route was blocked, obviously nothing moved. So over a period of I think 5 or 6 days, I really don't recall seeing the inside of my sleeping bag once, and we were sitting there getting this entire force into country. But once we had got them into country, we obviously were preparing for the cutover from the United Nations rules of engagement to the NATO rules of engagement, which were a good deal more robust, and a situation which I personally found highly amusing. And you'll probably maybe think I'm a bit of a ghoul for finding it so funny. Was that there was an infantry company very close to the brigade headquarters, and I went up to visit them one evening, and the company commander, fairly young chap, was getting a little bit stressed out because every night they had sniper fire coming into their position. They couldn't return any fire. I said, well, okay, so at midnight tonight, we change to the NATO rules of engagement. So what I suggest you do is put a couple of platoons worth of warrior up against that side of the berm, and any rounds come in, you've got Radon cannons, Hughes chain guns, GPMGs, and a whole load of angry grunts who would like to get something back. And lo and behold, at about 12:15, a single round came in, and the contact report read something like contact shooting, 1 round received, 12,500 rounds returned, no hits claimed. But rest assured, there were no more sniper rounds that came in to that position.
But I think that brings out a good point, because they pretty much had their own way up until that point, hadn't they? Because the rules of engagement were lacking. And, there's some quite shameful episodes throughout that sort of history there where you had, and I'm not just picking on this country, but they just happened to be there and it was their area, but the Dutch, was it Srebrenica?
Srebrenica, yeah, the 8,000.
Basically stood by and let, I can't remember who it was, Croats or Muslims or whatever
Bosnian
it was.
Serbs, weren't they? They took the
Serbs,
Serbs took the young men.
They took, was it Croats they took and killed about thousands of them?
8,000, I think, in the end.
Under the eye of the Dutch battle group. Yeah,
I think what surprised me about it, if you watch, it's on YouTube, from 92 to about 95, when the war was at its peak, the siege of Sarajevo. If you put that footage into black and white, it was all the Second World War. It was the old hatred from there as well. The tactics being used on industrial scale. It was horrendous. And I think, like you say, Matt, once you went in afterwards and you're trying to divide the people that are separated for over 50 years mentally in some places.
So the hatred, in fact, goes back way before that.
Centuries,
right the way back to the Moorish invasion, so the great movement south of the Moors, where there were a considerable number of very well documented massacres the other way round. And I think sadly grudges have been held for all this time. And for many years under the Soviet regime and Tito, they managed to hold peace and law and order, as was the case in so many places around the world under despotic leadership. They managed to keep a lid on a lot of this last century or previous centuries colonial backlash, and of course when they when that all finished, then it all kicked off. And funnily enough, even when we were there and handing out building materials and supplies to locals to try and get them to start rebuilding some of the infrastructure, which was absolutely decimated, I was personally privy to many conversations through the interpreters, obviously because my language isn't that good, where people were just saying, look, we're not going to bother, because as soon as you lot have gone, it's all going to kick off again anyway. Which I think I found emotionally quite hard, because there was a lot going on, and we lost a number of soldiers. A couple of incidents sort of sit pretty clearly with me until this day, and to hear that, well, it's a bit of a waste of time you being here anyway, I think was quite a difficult message.
You could argue it was ever thus, Matt. We already talked briefly about Northern Ireland.
Absolutely.
The Afghan veterans now that have seen what's happened in Afghanistan. Yes. And just looking at, people talk about Ukraine as if it's the first war in Europe for years, but they've completely forgotten about the devastation in the former Yugoslavia, which is probably
absolutely
on par with what's happening in Ukraine in a lot of respects.
Well, it was multiple wars, wasn't it, with Bosnia, when the split of Yugoslavia. But unfortunately, that was in the 90s, and people have got short memory.
They really have, and I think the initial conflict in Croatia again was quite short and sharp, but quite passionately fought by both sides, and then obviously the involvement of the Serbs later to make it a three-way civil war. And then, as I mentioned before, there probably as many as a dozen. I'll probably be corrected by a better historian than I, but certainly between 6 and 12 different paramilitary groups supporting various flavours of the desired outcome of each of the forces. It made it incredibly complex.
Well, the fact that we've still got stabilisation troops in both Bosnia and Kosovo today, 30 years later, just shows that we're nowhere near the end.
No, it's I think you mentioned Ukraine. You look at I've spent time in Ukraine recently, and I think before I went there, I wanted to be sure of my ground. So I read quite a lot of both ancient and recent Ukrainian history, and it is an incredibly complex landscape, and you can see absolutely why the conflict is continuing or has continued for so long in the Donbass. You can absolutely see why Ukrainians, particularly from the West, want to fight so hard to hold on to their homeland. One can understand, I suppose, why the old guard of the former Soviet empire hanker after the old days, given the precarious nature of their position in the world now. Not that I think there's any justification for their invasion whatsoever, but you can kind of see the reasons from all of the sides as to why it's being fought so passionately, which makes me personally believe that a favourable solution is some way off.
So going back to your Bosnia tour, what was the effect the tour had on you?
So I think it was the process of erosion, of seeing and hearing and experiencing some pretty grim things on an almost day by day, week by week basis. There was one particular point which still rings in my ears now, where we had a young patrol from the Light Dragoons who were patrolling one of the borders between the two factions. I think it was called Border Anvil from memory, down a route which was not shown to be mined. It was a very, very foggy day, I recall, and they went over a mine. The vehicle flipped, caught fire with a crew of 3 in the back. The ammunition load in the vehicle started to cook off. They couldn't get out. The vehicle behind them, again with a similar fairly young crew, were trying to get to the vehicle. We at brigade headquarters were listening to all of this unfold live on the radio, trying to get aid through to them. Helicopters couldn't fly. We couldn't get vehicles down the route, and of course, you both know these things do tend to unfold quite quickly. And then I realised that the vehicle commander was actually the baby brother of a good friend of mine who I went to Sandhurst with, and sadly, all three of those soldiers didn't come out of that alive. And I think that was one of the incidents that really started to affect me. Another one was during a reconnaissance up in the northwest of the country. Went into a small town where the Serbian forces had withdrawn and basically strung up anybody they could find from a doorway or a lamppost or a signpost, and booby-trapped bodies and all the rest of it. So driving into this town as probably one of the first people who'd been there afterwards. Again, that was a kind of another incident, which was a period of. People have to deal with far worse in their life. I'm not saying that these were in any way comparable to some of the things that both soldiers and civilians have to deal with, but I think it was the sort of erosion on me that started to kind of get to me. I finished that tour definitely with some with a debt to go back to my mind to do some fixing, to try and get myself back to being the happy-go-lucky person I was before. Suffered with what I now know to be depression, but certainly didn't know at the time.
It's interesting you use the term erosion there, because in my experience, it happens in two ways. You can either have a big bang event, which affects you almost, instantaneously, or you have that drip, as you referred to. It just chips away at you till you can't cope anymore.
Yeah, cumulative. Yeah,
cumulative. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, cumulative. It just builds up, and it builds that pressure up.
No, absolutely. I think it was probably not consciously, but was quite instrumental in my decision to subsequently leave the army. There one or two other things happened after that which kind of contributed, but I had two young kids. I'd seen a lot of dead kids whilst I was over there, and I thought, I really don't know that I want to load any more of this on my mind going forward, and decided to leave. But I think funnily enough, at that point I kind of drew a bit of a line underneath it, and puffed my chest out and squashed it all down, and just kind of got on with it, really. And I don't know that at that time I felt that I carried any long-term damage from my time out there.
You left knowing that your time was up, and you went to the civilian world. How did you cope? I mean, because it's a transition in itself. That it's quite a stressful time. You're looking for a new job. You're trying to find a new role. You've left a lifestyle and a vocation behind you, because it's not just a job, the army. And you had those experiences that you've already described. So, just what happened after you left the army at that point?
I was incredibly fortunate in that my path out of the army was quite a simple one, and I went straight into another very good job with plenty of money and a fairly good support network. So in itself, that wasn't difficult. And I think I'd come from such a high pressure, stressful environment. I entered a period of calmness, because the job that I ended up doing was certainly nobody was shooting at me. It was a period of calm in my life. But I was definitely drinking too much. I was definitely not sleeping very well. I tried to keep myself physically fit and healthy, but wasn't doing a particularly good job at that. I started to, was very much on a slightly downward path. And then sadly had a major life event in that my partner and the love of my life was killed in a tragic accident. And it was at that point that the wheels came off Matthew Harding almost completely. And it wasn't necessarily that particular event, as tragic as it was. People do die, and you kind of get over it and get on with it. The reaction was far more severe than that. I really did become very mentally unwell, and straight into what we now know to be full-on post-traumatic stress disorder, and didn't really seek out or get any treatment for some considerable amount of time. I self-medicated. I was drinking fairly ridiculous quantities of alcohol, abusing Class A drugs, trying to maintain quite a busy job, and maintain some semblance of fatherhood to my two children that I had at the time, who were more grown up at that point, but really not very succeeding in any of those areas.
Was that method of dealing with the circumstances you're in, was that down to denial or fear of stigma, or a combination of both, or something else?
I think that's a really good question, and I don't know that I've fully really considered the answer to that. I think it was probably a mixture of all of the above. There was then, much more than now, a tremendous stigma to admitting that you had mental health issues, lifelong career limiting issues, by saying, look, I've got a problem with my mental health. You can pretty much kiss goodbye to wherever it was you were working, and indeed the next job as well, because there was this, well, you don't want to hire him, he's got a screw loose kind of thing. So there was that. There was also the effect of the illness itself is to keep driving you forward into your fear. It is almost self-worsening, because you just keep fighting forward. And pouring alcohol and substances on top of it to try and keep a lid on the rage elements, and then also trying to medicate yourself to sleep every night. It's a very toxic cocktail.
How did you break that cycle?
So I did seek help eventually. I had a couple of really quite terrifying episodes for my friends and family, and a number of people said to me, look, we really do want you to get some help. I was fortunate enough to have a very good private health plan, so started seeing a private psychiatrist, and really started getting some treatment. Although I have to say, the treatment at that stage didn't end up being particularly helpful. I very heavily medicated, and I went to see a counsellor in Harley Street, as recommended by my psychiatrist. And I was having a particularly bad day, and I started to describe to him something which had been really bothering me and keeping me awake for several days. The counsellor burst into tears in front of me and expressed that he really didn't feel that he could deal with me, because I was so unwell, that he just didn't think that he was strong enough to listen to some of the things that I was telling him, and wanted to check me into a facility for other counsellors. I left that meeting feeling a bit let down, frankly, and I walked straight into a pub, drank a ridiculous quantity of alcohol, and then that night tried comprehensively to take my own life. And very, very fortunately, and I'm very pleased to be here saying this today, I was as effective at that as I am at map reading, and completely failed. And the A&E consultant said to me a couple of days later, he said, look, I've absolutely no idea how you pulled this off, but it looks like you're going to live. He said, I really didn't think that this was ever going to be possible, but you're going to make it. And that was a turning point, funnily enough, to see my two children and my parents standing by my bed, having been told, this is it, he's absolutely comprehensively done for. And I had the most wonderful counsellor after that event, who was part of the crisis mental health team at Farnham Road Mental Hospital in Guildford, who was just tremendous, and he came and spent time with me every single day, and just kind of made me feel that, you know what, don't be ridiculous. There is another way. You can get up and you can get out of this. So I stopped drinking, stopped taking drugs. I say I stopped drinking. Those of you know me know that I do still enjoy a beer or two, but I stopped drinking ridiculously. Stopped drinking in the style of Ozzy Osbourne and started drinking in the style of a relatively normal human being, and just got better and better. And when I did get to a period of strength, everything else started to fall into place for me. I started to rekindle friendships friends stuck with me, but a lot of friends didn't necessarily know how to be with me. And therefore it was very difficult for them to be. I was constantly a wreck. Every time I'd had a few drinks, I used to fall into this pattern of just self-destructive thought, and very, very difficult for people to be around.
It's interesting what you described there, because we've had a number of podcasts with guests who describe very, very similar to you, that path, Matt. And you described also a minute ago about how your friends possibly didn't understand. And I had a real wake-up call in the podcast we did with Neil Hogg, who you know very well. He's talking to me, and I just clicked that, how we just didn't get what was wrong with Neil back in the day. We had the man up thing. We had put him and another couple of guys who are suffering from PTSD and nightmares, and our solution was to put them in a room at the end of the corridor.
Yeah.
And I came off that podcast and I said to my wife, the guilt I had from that podcast was horrendous, because thinking back to how we treated JD, and I was talking to Kev about it afterwards, and he said, but we didn't understand it.
No, and I think that's the challenge is PTSD, you need to be aware of it, that you may suffer from it, but everyone, including the people in the forces, need to know how to deal with it as well, because we didn't have any background to understanding that.
No, difficult. Absolutely, and I think it is understanding that it hits everybody in a different way, and trying to educate people and give them a list of things to look out for is virtually impossible. The advice I would give is look at what your friend is normally like, and if things are wildly different from that, start to ask yourself why, and start to dig into that, and start to ask open questions. And I think one of the things that we do, I know we're going to talk a little bit about charities and the association, but one of the things that we do is try to signpost people to easy steps that they can get to in order to get some hooks into reality, to try and get themselves to a point where they can hold themselves up enough out of where they are to turn back and look at themselves and say, do you know what, mate, you're not right, you need help.
Yeah, I think because we've done a number of episodes now talking about PTSD. We've had JD, we had Chris, who came on board as well about a civilian incident rather than military. And it is, how do you recognise it? How do you help somebody? And how can they help themselves? It's such a massive challenge, because you don't know if you've got it, do you? You can slip without knowing, and that's the challenge.
And I think people react quite badly to being told that they have an issue, and probably quite understandably. I think it's a realization that somebody has to come to themselves. So it's creating an environment and creating a dialogue that allows them to realize actually that things are not as they should be.
A lot like you said as well, today, people are not judged in the same way it was. 20 years ago, PTSD, mental health issues, the army struggled to recognise it, civilian street struggled to recognise it. We're now starting to recognise it much more. But there's still a slight stigma. There are still people there who still think the man up beat and all the rest of it. I think that attitude is still out there a little bit. And it's also in yourself. You're trying to think, well, it's not me. It's not. I'm not suffering from it. There's a denial, I think, as well for people.
That is absolutely true. I mean, so I think if you take a 100-year perspective, we're getting better, because clearly soldiers in the First War being shot for cowardice when they were suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder or similar illnesses. And I think a great deal more is actually understood about it. People understand why it happens. People understand that the brain, it's not about bravery or capability, that the brain has a finite capacity for being put into danger and disobeying its flight reflex, which is basically you're throwing somebody into a situation where they know they're likely to get killed, and they keep doing it when everything about their brain is telling them to do something differently. And it's that conflict which is creating these different wirings, and they take a long time to unpick.
You're the president of our Special Observers Association, Matt, and I know you do a lot of good work on that, helping people out. Do you find that helping others helps you?
Absolutely. And prior to doing that, and whilst I was very much in recovery, a friend of mine who is a youth counsellor said to me, I wonder if you might like to come and help our charity. We've got a board of really well-meaning trustees, some excellent quality counsellors, but the whole thing is just chaotic, and we're not achieving what we need to achieve because we don't have somebody with the right communication and leadership skills at board level that can structure us and get us going forward on the right strategy. And they made it very clear that they didn't want me to get anywhere near the clinical side and get anywhere near the sort of the whole delivery end of the organisation. It was purely the strategy of the charity. So I started to work, and it was called Number 5 Counselling, and it provides free counselling to young people in the Reading area. And obviously I grew up over in that area, and delivers thousands of counselling sessions to young people who would otherwise go completely untreated, because counselling on the NHS is subscribed out for very long waiting lists. It wasn't until the Reading Rock Festival the following year, when I went to pick up my daughter and a friend of hers to drive them home, and her friend said, "Oh, where have you been?" I said, "Well, I've been at a board meeting with my charity, which is Number 5." And she said, "My God, if it wasn't for Number 5, I wouldn't be here." This young lady was sadly very seriously sexually assaulted a very long time ago, had nobody to turn to, from a very strong religious family who really didn't want to know about it, and couldn't get counselling on the NHS, and the Number 5 charity absolutely stepped in and changed this young lady's life. Now, she today is, I won't say anything which will even remotely identify. She's got a very high-powered job. She's incredibly successful, got a fantastic degree from a fabulous university. And that story in itself said, this is your path. You need to do more of this, because I got so much from that interaction that I sought out to do more of it. So I started fundraising for some military charities. There's an amazing charity called Pilgrims Bandits, who work predominantly with unconventional soldiers, shall we say? So from the spectrum of the sort of people that you've been talking to, and recognise that people who've come out of maybe special forces or other similar type roles because of serious injury or mental health issues or whatever, suddenly have a huge part of their identity missing, and therefore they organise adventurous training type events for seriously injured soldiers. For example, they reenacted the Cockleshell Heroes raid in canoes with a number of soldiers, all of whom were either multiple or indeed total amputees, and canoed all the way down and completed the same mission in the same time frame, which is absolutely phenomenal. Supported soldiers in round the world cycling, in phenomenal rowing or swimming, or canoeing down rapids or whatever it may be, and really making a tremendous difference to the holistic recovery of some of these people. So I've been doing some work with them, and reciprocally they have given a considerable amount of funds to some of the Special Observers Association folks over the years. Some of our people who have needed a little bit of financial help. Pilgrims Bandits have on a number of occasions put their hand in their pocket and ponied up and really helped us out. They are a phenomenal bunch of people. Go and look up their website, give them some money, support them in whatever way you can. They're really, really wonderful. But yes, it's so the association, I think I've been involved in since it was formed. At our 30th anniversary, 10 years ago, up in Catterick, we formed it and volunteered to be on the council and have been part of the council ever since, and by default have been coerced into being president again now. So we're a funny old bunch. We do we do a lot of work behind the scenes, a lot of quiet work with people who need support outside the chain of command. We don't deliver any counselling or mental health aid ourselves. We signpost very much to trusted advisors. PTSD resolution is one. Certainly, the general, our patron, is a keen supporter of that particular charity. But we also provide lots of other advice, legal or just general life mentoring for folks who who are making the transition to come out of a really quite frenetic military career, and bearing in mind that some of our soldiers have spent longer in Afghanistan than a soldier would have spent had he fought World War I and World War II back to back. It's really quite a sobering way of looking at just how much combat these people have seen. So helping them move on with their life in many ways, or just helping them pick up the pieces when things go wrong, because things do go wrong in everybody's life, and everybody needs a bit of a hand up sometimes, and that's what we do. From the people we've just talked on this podcast with, one thing that's perfectly clear is you don't cure PTSD.
No,
you don't cure that mental side. You learn to coping mechanisms to get on with your life. Every so often, you may well have a dip again. Mm-hmm. Is that what you found in your case, Matt? I think so. I would say the reason I'm hesitating is I'm thinking in recent years much less. Although I think I'm particularly good at managing myself now. I avoid things which I know are going to trigger me. I will avoid certain news stories. I will avoid certain types of movie or book because it takes me to a place which fosters and nurtures those thoughts which I really don't want to come back. I have dealt with the things that I was part of, and have made the sort of the mental leap that I can't do anything about them now. But sure, still in the wee small hours when one can't sleep and you're wondering how dragons blow out candles or whatever it is you think about when you're when you're trying to get to sleep in the middle of the night, they do come back. But I think it's been a very long time since I experienced any of the true symptoms of PTSD. And I think you talk to people who suffered far worse than I. They literally find themselves transported back to the incident. I think I read something on Facebook or Twitter or something the other day. When you ask a veteran when the last time he was over there, very often the question is every night, and for some people that is absolutely the case. But for me, it's very much in its place now. It is a lifetime ago. I feel like I'm a very different person, and I channel it into trying to help others who are suffering similarly to I did. Well, thanks for that, mate. I know that was quite a difficult conversation in places, and we appreciate your frankness. But we always finish off with a bit of lightheartedness, and that's Desert Island Dits, which is the guest choice of book, film and luxury item. So, Matt, what have you picked? I had thought long and hard about books because I am a fairly prolific reader and have been throughout my life. But I thought if I had to have one book, I find myself travelling the world a great deal in my current role. And I'm always staggered by my own ignorance when I start talking to people who've grown up there and how little I know about the history and the culture and all the rest of it. I read recently Marr's Complete History of the World, which I found absolutely fascinating, but not very good as a reference book because it's very much told as a story. So I looked at the Times Complete History of the World as my book,
because I thought wherever I went in the world, I could at least flick to that page and look up the ancient and modern history of where I am and signpost myself to future study. Film choice again is a funny one. You both will resonate with this. Where you're sitting in a ready room or a guard room somewhere, or you're the ARF commander, and they've only got 2 films, and they go on time and time again, and they stick with you in your mind, and for some reason, for the entire rest of your life, you can't not go and watch them. One of those films for me was Highlander, and the other one was The Shawshank Redemption. Both of which I had whilst doing a job. They were literally the 2. I think we had 3 films. Those 2 and Trading Places with Eddie Murphy, and we literally watched them continuously, 24 hours a day. So I think my life would not be complete if I didn't have at least one of them with me to last me till the end of time.
Luxury item, and this doesn't surprise me when you can see what this is.
Well, as you can tell by my slim physique, food is very, very important to me. And I have an uncle. Had an uncle who was a famous chef, and my mother was an amazing cook. So cooking is my thing. And you look into my kitchen, and there's every gadget you could possibly imagine. So I couldn't really be without something from my kitchen, and if I had to choose one thing, it would be my set of kitchen knives, so that I could create fantastic food and keep my body in the shape of a proper senior officer.
Are we allowed to name your famous uncle? Because I've got a bit.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
I've got a bit of a bit I want to say about him. Is that?
Of course, no, by all means, yeah.
So Matt's been very modest when he says he had a quite a famous uncle. Your uncle was Keith Floyd.
Keith Floyd, classic.
Yeah. And
they still show him on TV. He comes on every so often.
Certainly do.
But anyway, so
timeless.
For some mad reason, after we came back from the Gulf, Matt invited me and a couple of lads to his wedding, and I believe. I think I sat at the table with your uncle, the same table.
I think you did, yeah.
And
he said, who was that man? I couldn't understand a word what he said.
I could only cook menu A and B, right? And now 30 years later, I take more interest in food. But I often say to my wife, what a wasted opportunity. I was sat next to him and I could have a conversation with him. I think I remember being more enthralled by his young girlfriend he had with him.
Yeah, he was one of 5 marriages. I'm trying to catch him up, but that one didn't go particularly well. That was I think that was Shauna, wasn't it? The young blonde one. That's right. Yeah. No, but funnily enough, I never thought he was a particularly good cook. Personally, he was a great TV personality.
Oh, brilliant!
And he knew so much about food. His knowledge of food was absolutely encyclopedic.
I remember he was good entertainment at the wedding as well. So
some funny moments.
I don't know if you videoed it. It's probably just as well you didn't.
I did. No, I did actually. Yeah. So I've got videos of all of them. I've got a video wall in my study.
All of them. Steven Spielberg.
It's not my fault. I'm addicted to marzipan.
All right, thanks for
Fair
that.
enough.
And on that bombshell, Kev, we'll move on to your choice of book this week.
It's called Afghan Napoleon by Sandy Gall. Everyone hopefully people will still remember Sandy Gall from the old days.
Is he alive? Is he still alive?
I didn't check to see if he was alive or dead. So I'm going to treat him as alive still.
Okay.
But in the 70s and 80s and 90s, Sandy Gall was always on the TV, international reporter. Anyway, he wrote a book about a guy called, and I'll try and pronounce it properly, Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the lion in Afghanistan during the Russian invasion. So in 1979, when the Russians invaded, obviously Afghanistan, very tribal, had various resistance groups, Mujahideen, all being supplied by various groups, Western powers. But he was one of the most successful. And Sandy Gall embedded with him for a few weeks and then wrote his story. And as part of the Northern Alliance, after the Russians went, he started fighting the Taliban, very successful warlord. And unfortunately, 2 days before September the 11th, when the towers were hit, he was assassinated by a camera crew. So they came in, pretended they were going to do a camera crew and an interview, and they assassinated him. However, his struggle from the Russian invasion through to the Taliban set the scene for the tribal groups, the Northern Alliance, and the successes of NATO, or the Americans and Brits, when they went in 2001, 2002, it set the scene, especially in the North. And to note, his son today is now the new lion, and he's the resistance fighter in one of the valleys in Afghanistan. And he looks exactly the same as his father. But a great book to read if you like Afghan history. It's the old history. But it just shows, with just a little bit of weapon systems, a little bit of help from the West, how strong they became when they were fighting against what was then the Soviet Union.
I remember Sandy Gall doing the reports when they first got the Stingers.
Yeah,
he went behind the lines on donkeys with the Stinger deliveries and filmed them bringing down Soviet Hind attack helicopters.
They just did the job.
Yeah. He is indeed still alive.
Oh, he's still alive.
He was born in 1927, Ferg, so you've probably got something in common with him.
Share the same birthday.
Right, okay, thanks for that.
So what's yours then, Carl?
Mine's tying in with what Matt was saying, mate, about going to countries and not knowing the sort of the history. And a couple of months ago, Kev said to me, why don't we walk the Hadrian's Wall? And I said, yeah, we'll do that. And I said, let's camp. And Kev goes, no, we're not camping. We're going to get hotels and bed and breakfast. And I got in a bit of a hissy fit and said, why are we doing that? Let's go back to the old days. Wild camping is what I called it. Anyway, I relented, threw my teddy in the corner. And we were one section of Hadrian's Wall, and I was looking out across this wall, and the heavens opened up. And I had the worst soaking I've had in years. And we got to this bar, and I was never more grateful to be in a barn with Kev and mother, mate, farting away they were. I even had to go and sleep in another room because it was like sleeping with two buffaloes with sucking chest wounds. Just like being back in the army. But anyway, it's an amazing structure. I didn't realise the full extent of it. You know what I mean? It was more than just a barricade. It was a whole community along the length of it. It was required a vision and an outstanding level of engineering skill we couldn't master today. It was 80 miles, built in under 10 years. We can't even bring a railway line in on time. Can't even build a nuclear power station.
No. I mean, when you think about the tools they use, the manpower, the surveying, and again, when you say 10 years, and that's to build all those little forts all the way along as well. And all
ditches,
those
the big ditches.
It's unbelievable.
It was 4 metres high, and it was rendered white as well, which I never knew, so it could be also, it was a visual sign of power as well. And one of the things I was reading in this book was, it tells you about a load of tablets, wood tablets, which are essentially letters they found at Vindolanda Fort. And reading these letters from soldiers going to and forts, it's all the same complaints of modern soldiers. Can you send me socks? The food's crap. And then you read about how the weights they carried, the amount of digging they did, and their terms of service were broadly similar to what we did as well. 25 years in, you got your pension, which was citizenship and a piece of land, and you could retire. Women's rights weren't too good. Your kids got to be Roman citizens, but your wife didn't for some reason. And there's brilliant museums there at Vindolanda, Housesteads, and it's obviously got the beauty of the Cumbrian and Northumbrian landscapes. And it's a real testimony to the power and reach of the Roman Empire. And if you're southern, you might not be able to hack the weather, but if you fancy a challenge, get up there and give it a walk.
I'll tell you something that you may or may not know about Hadrian's Wall. That it is not now, and never has been, the border between England and Scotland.
Correct, yeah. And
everybody thinks it's also not very effective because you're clearly down here.
He can't keep a Scot out,
he could swim round it.
Matt, that's it for another episode, Matt. Thanks for coming on the podcast. And to you, the listener, if you continue support and suggestions, please keep them coming in. And our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And I said at the start, give us a review on iTunes or on Spotify, it'd be great. And finally, thanks to Nick Beale for his continuing support and sponsorship to the series and offering technical support through his company ISARR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.